I'd like to add my good morning. My name is Dave. I'm part of the church family here, part of the leadership team here, and it's my privilege to be... I don't have a glass for my water. I've left it down. Rue, is there any chance you could... I'd left it down on the floor. I'm very sorry. I know I'm going to need it this morning. Welcome. Welcome, whether you're here in person or whether you're joining us online. Thank you very, very much for being here. And we are continuing our journey through the book of Mark, which we started at the beginning of January, titled Jesus at the Center of It All, seeking to put Jesus at the center of our church, at the center of our life, at the center of our community. If you don't have a Bible, Guy is coming round and Richard is coming round, and there's people upstairs as well who I can't quite see. So do put your hand up and they can get you a Bible so you can be following along in God's Word. For the last few weeks, we've been exploring a theme that is tracked throughout Mark's Gospel. We've been exploring the theme of people who set themselves in opposition against Jesus, who set themselves up against him, who rejected him, who said no to him. And there's something that, again and again, as we've looked at people who rejected who Jesus claimed to be and rejected who he was, there's something again and again that we've seen, which is that people claiming certain things about Jesus, people saying no to him because of this or no to him because of that, doesn't actually change who Jesus is. People saying you're just a man doesn't make him just a man. People saying you're a sinner doesn't make him a sinner. The reasons that people then and people now choose to reject Jesus don't change who he is one little bit. What those statements do is they reveal something about the person who's making them. If someone says, a few weeks ago when Jackie really helpfully helped us explore the idea of people who said no to Jesus because he broke the rules, because he's a rule breaker. What that really shows isn't that Jesus broke God's rules. What that shows is that the people had the wrong view of what those rules should have been. When a couple of weeks, Steve Gorkroger helped us explore Jesus the blasphemer, people who said that he was blaspheming, that he was demonic. They couldn't deny his power. And what that really showed was that they were threatened. They saw his power, but they couldn't attribute it to God, so they needed to attribute it to someone else because they weren't willing to take him as he was. When last week Malcolm helped us explore a passage where people said, well, Jesus was just a man, he's just a person. What that really didn't make him just a man. What that did was show that they couldn't have an imagination that was expanded enough that could see anything else in this person. They could only see him on their own terms. And today we come to another claim that people made about Jesus, which is simply, he was sinful. He was unclean. I doubt there are many people here today who would want to level that accusation against Jesus. So does this sermon have nothing to say to us? Well, I hope not. Because actually what this does is it exposes the wrong view of sin that these people had. And that might be a wrong view of sin that sometimes we can fall into as well, as we approach our own lives, as we approach other people's lives. So we're going to look this morning at people who didn't want anything to have to do with Jesus or his disciples because they thought that they were sinful. They thought they were unclean. It's Mark chapter 7, and it's verses 1 to 23. Mark 7, verses 1 to 23. Let me read. Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around him, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders, and they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not live according to the traditions of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? He said to them, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human traditions. Then he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to keep your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever speaks evil of father or mother must surely die. But you say that if anyone tells father or mother, whatever support you might have had from me is korban, that is, an offering to God, then you no longer permit doing anything for a father or mother, thus making void the word of God through your tradition that you have handed on. And you do many things like this. Then he called the crowd again and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile." When he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. He said to them, "Then do you also fail to understand? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and goes out into the sewer?" Thus he declared all foods clean. And he said, "It is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these things, these evil things, come from within, and they defile a person." So in Mark, we have this escalating conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. From very early on, they did not like what he was saying. They did not like what he was doing. They set themselves against him. And at times, they come to him and deliberately try to catch him out, deliberately ask a very pointed question to try and show that he was not someone who was worth following. And this is one of those times. They're not shy about it. They don't try and hide what they're doing. And Jesus, in turn, comes back very strongly and plainly. They're having a very honest conversation and dialogue. But why this time do they object to him? What grounds do they have to object to Jesus in this passage? Well, very simply, it's to do with hand washing. It's to do with washing hands. I want to make it clear, this isn't a hygiene thing. I think it's good to wash your hands before you have a meal. I do that. My teachers taught me that. My parents taught me that. It's a good idea. It's a good idea to make sure you don't have any unwanted bacteria on your hands. But that's not what Jesus is talking about here. They're talking about ritual cleanness. They're talking about ceremonial purity. And it was very much the tradition to wash your hands, not necessarily to get them physically clean, but just to present yourself clean before God before you eat. The word that they use when they level this accusation that the disciples were eating with defiled hands, the word defiled just means common. It means commonplace. It means something that's not been deliberately and actively presented to God. It was a hot topic of the day, and different groups of people, different factions within the Pharisees had different ideas about what was and wasn't appropriate, how you should wash your hands, when you should wash your hands, how often you should do it, what foods you could or couldn't. There were lots of different disagreements about this whole area. So they're sort of trying to probe Jesus on it and say, "What do you make of this? Why are you doing this? Surely what you're doing demonstrates that you're not really committed to purity. You're a sinner. You're unclean." But the way they ask the question demonstrates something. What does this show us? The way they ask the question in verse 5. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the traditions of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" Notice they're very honest. They say, "Why do you not live according to the tradition of the elders?" That's the thing for them. There are these traditions that Jesus is not keeping. They're very honest. They don't say, "Why are you breaking the law of Moses?" Because they know that this isn't in the law of Moses. This is a tradition that their elders, that their ancestors have passed on to them. So how have they got to this tradition if it's not in the law, if it's not in the Old Testament laws given through Moses? Well, that's sort of the bit in brackets in verses 3 and 4, where Mark sort of cuts into this story and explains some of the traditions they have, saying that the people would wash their hands in accordance with the tradition of the elders. And in Numbers chapter 18, there are some instructions given to priests in the Old Testament. And the priests, whenever they would eat food that had been offered as a sacrifice, food that was presented as holy before God, they were to wash their hands ceremonially before they ate it. Then, over time, that's the only law that's given, very specific, priests and sacrificed food. Then, over time, gradually, the priests started saying, "Well, we're going to do that for all food. Whenever we eat anything, we're going to wash our hands ceremonially." And then, after a while, a group within the Jewish people that ended up being part of the Pharisees, a group called the Habirim, they started to say, "Well, that needs to be everyone. Everyone needs to wash their hands before they eat anything." So we've gone from a very specific, just the priests and just sacrificed food, to all people for all food. And it started with a law and it became a tradition. They built on top of it. Let's imagine for a moment that someone owns a garden There's a great estate with maybe a stately home, but it has these wonderful grounds. It has gardens, it has lawns, it has wonderful flower beds, it has ornate fountains. It's a beautiful place, and the owner wants for lots of people to be able to enjoy the gardens. So he opens it up, but he appoints some people to sort of look after the gardens and manage how it's done so that the people can get the most out of the gardens. And these people go and they say, it's a wonderful garden, it's a beautiful place, we need to try and maintain it, we need to try and keep it. And these fountains and these flower beds, we need to make sure that no one ends up accidentally trampling them or falling into them or doing something that will damage them. So what we'll do is we'll just put little fences up around the fountains and around the flower beds. Because why wouldn't you? People can still see them, people can still enjoy them. It's not hurting anyone's enjoyment of these things. And then the next generation of sort of the people who are looking after this garden, who are managing it for the owner, come along and they see the fences and they go, oh, these fences, we need to make sure that these fences are protected. We need to try and keep people away from the fences because the fences are clearly very important. Otherwise, no one would have put them up. So I tell you what, let's encourage people not even to walk on the grass, so they can't even get near the fence. Then the next generation of people come along and go, oh, well, there's these signs saying keep off the grass. Clearly the grass is very important. We need to keep people away from the grass. So I tell you what, let's not even let people walk on the paths anymore, because if they're walking on the paths, they might slip off into the grass. And if they go on the grass, they might get near those very, very important fences. And if they go anywhere near the fence, there's a chance they might topple over into the fountain. And so there's suddenly people aren't even allowed to get anywhere near. They're just allowed to stay in the house. But now people can't even see the bit that they were meant to enjoy in the first place. And that's what happened with the law. Because there was law, there was a heart that God wanted people to have, a way that people wanted them to live. And people, with very good intentions, added to that and said, we want to be so careful not to break this that we'll actually add an extra layer. And then the next generation come along and they try and protect that layer, and it goes on and on and on. These weren't bad traditions. But actually, they stopped people seeing the law that was at the heart of it. We're going to explore that idea in a little bit more because Jesus goes into more detail about it. But Jesus responds to them very clearly and very plainly. It's actually quite blunt. In verse 6 and 7 and 8, he simply calls them hypocrites. He says that they're coming with this question, but he can see through it to their heart. And their heart demonstrates that they are hypocrites. He uses these verses from Isaiah, which sort of show two aspects of what hypocrisy looks like that they are adopting when they're coming to him with this question. The first is lip service. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They've got an external thing that looks like something, that sounds like something, but actually their hearts are very, very different. Internally, there's something very, very different. Jesus comes to explore that in verses 14 to 23, which we'll look at later on. But the word hypocrite, literally, it just means someone who wears a mask, puts a mask in front of their face, because it comes from the Greek theatres where there would be these actors who would stand with these masks in front of their face to proclaim a character or an emotion. And actually, the emotion of the mask was nothing to do with the actor who was underneath. It was just a mask to present something that wasn't real, to present something false. That's fine in a theatre, but in our lives, if we're presenting a front and a mask that isn't true of what we actually want, of what we actually are like, then that's a bad thing. So that's the first aspect of hypocrisy. The second is this in verse 7, in vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. This is elevating human ideas to the level of God, saying that my experience and my understanding are more important than what God has said. Jesus challenges both of these things in reverse order. These are also important challenges for us because we can live lives which are very different on the outside than we are on the inside. We can think that if we get our externals right, then the internal must follow and must be fine. That's just not true. And we can sometimes be in danger of thinking that our ideas and our traditions are more important than what God has asked us to be like. So Jesus defends himself in two ways. He challenges both of these things. The first is exposing a selectivity and an elevating of their own ideas above God's. And he does this by choosing something very, very specific. They've challenged him on this whole thing of hand washing. He comes back and challenges them on something equally specific. And it's this idea of what he calls korban, which is a word that just means something that is given to God, that is set apart for God, that has been given into God's service. And this whole section from verses 9 to 13, where he points at them and he says, Moses told you to honor your father and mother. But you say that this thing that I have that I could possibly have used to honor my mother or father, I've dedicated it to God. I've decided to call it korban. And something that was korban was simply something that was given to God's service. That could be done in a temple by giving it to a priest and saying, use this in whatever way will glorify God the most. Or it could just be done by taking this land or this property or this wealth and saying, I'm choosing to corner this off and say, this is given to God. It's for his use. I'm not actually going to let go and give it to anyone else, but it's for his use. And as soon as you've done that, something that was given to God's use couldn't be used for anything else. Couldn't possibly then be lowered to be used for a human being. That's actually something that we do find in the Old Testament. Things that were given to the temple service, things that were given to the priests, things that were given into God's hands, they were set apart. They weren't then to be used for general common use. But people were using that in order to take things that they didn't really want to give away in the first place and saying, well, this is set apart for God, so no, mum, dad, you can't have it. And actually, there's a problem there, because that's never what this idea of giving something to God was designed to do. God was very specific about the things he did want the people to give to him. Anything that they were giving on top was their choice. And if they were choosing to do that in a way that meant that they couldn't actually honor one of the 10 Commandments, then there's a real problem there. It's not that things shouldn't be set aside for God, but this tradition of oaths declaring things for God ended up trumping the commandment that God had given in the first place. Let's go back to our garden, shall we? Because the managers have had a bit of a telling off from the owner and been told, no, you need to try again because it wasn't working the first time. So they think, okay, we really need to try and help people to enjoy these gardens. I tell you what, it'd be great if they could enjoy lovely picnics on the lawns. So let's try that for a bit. But hang on, wait. If they go on the lawns to have a picnic, then what if they end up kicking a ball around? Because that's just what you do after you've had a picnic for a while, or throwing a frisbee. And what if the frisbee or the ball ends up going over one of these little barriers and goes into a flower bed and then end up trampling it? Okay, so no ball games on the lawn. We've decided that. No ball games, no frisbee, none of that. In fact, we probably shouldn't even allow them to have picnics anymore, because if they do that, then it might go wrong. So, okay, no ball games and no picnics. In fact, what does count as a picnic anyway? Because I tell you what if someone's walking along and they just get a sandwich out of their pocket and they eat it, and then it could all go a bit wrong. Okay, we need to draw a clear line. We need to say no picnics, no ball games, no food. And I tell you what, they're only allowed onto the lawns for 30 minutes at a time, because that way we can keep it all under control. And that's the only way to ensure that all of the garden is protected, isn't it? But that's not what the owner said was important. What the owner said was important is let people enjoy my garden. He didn't say put rules in place. He didn't say stop this or stop that. He didn't even say protect my garden. He said let people enjoy it. And these rules, which theoretically can start from a good place to protect something that God has said, end up getting in the way of what God has said. This is what Jesus is talking about. These traditions that people have built up, stopping them from actually following the law in the first place. Following the letter of the traditions stop them following the spirit of the law. That's what's going on here. People aren't able to honor their father and mother fully because they've decided that this stuff that they didn't really want to give to their mum and dad in the first place is now given to God's service. Matthew 23, Jesus is talking to Pharisees, and he comes out with very, very strong statements. He says, "Woe to you, you hypocrites." And he says that for 7 different reasons. And one of them, he says, woe to you because you're diligent in tithing, even your mint and your dill. He says your herbs, you take them and you divide them into tenths and you give a tenth of it to the temple. But you're so busy doing that you neglect the weightier matters of the law. I sometimes wonder, can we be in danger of being so careful to follow all of the traditions that we or others have built up that we actually neglect God's heart? That we actually aren't seeking after what he would have us do with the totality of our lives. We're just focused on those little things. Or do we measure things purely by our own standards, by the traditions and things that we've decided are important? I was preaching at a church a few years back. It's an Anglican church. And like many Anglican churches, like many churches, there was a service book, a service register. And after the service, I was taken out into the vestry because I was the preacher and I needed to sign the book. And it has lots of different columns: date, what passages were read out, who the preacher was, whether there was communion, who led communion, number of people who were present, all of that sort of stuff. But in this one, I've seen a number of these books, but in this one, someone had added an extra column on the end. They'd taken a ruler on every page and they'd added a column. And at the top, it just said service duration. And in it, it sort of said, 1 hour, 15 minutes, 38 minutes. Some of you are thinking 38 minutes sounds fantastic. And in this book, I thought, why? Why is there this extra column? And so I asked the guy. I asked the church warden, who's the one that had taken me out. And he said, well, let me tell you. Our vicar keeps saying that we need to be a worshipping community. We need to grow in worship. We need to be worshipping God more. So I thought, if I add this column, then each week I can multiply service duration by number of attendees. And this is the phrase he used. And that way I can calculate how many worship hours we have accrued. And I thought, that's astonishing. That's remarkable. And it's awful. Because it's just not the way that God thinks about worship. But he was taking a very human measure of just length of time that we're in a building. Because some of his tradition obviously said that if you're in church, you must be worshipping. And that more people means that more worship is happening. And these are very human ways of looking at it, but he was letting his traditions and the things that he'd consciously or unconsciously picked up and letting them become more important than actual worship. The kind of worship that God calls for, the kind of worship that the Bible draws us to. I wonder if we're ever in danger of doing that. That might be a blatant story which we can look at and go, that's just obviously wrong. But where are we guilty of doing that, of putting our own traditions above God's? Then Jesus comes maybe even to the heart of the matter. From verse 14 onwards in this passage, he moves away from the very specific example that he's given them and then that he's giving to them. And he comes to the heart of really, what is sin about? What is it that determines someone and whether they are pure and whether they are clean or unclean? They've got a wrong view of sin itself. It's an external versus internal thing. Jesus goes back a step, and in verse 15 he says, there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. Because these people, these Pharisees, the way that they even ask the question, they're interested in external actions. They're interested in washing or not washing, clean hands, unclean hands. And in their mind, unclean hands, which is something that they can see, something that they can measure, must mean that the food that then is eaten must become unclean. And so the people must become unclean. Right? Well, Jesus says no. That's not what clean and unclean is about. They've misunderstood what makes a person unclean, because the cleanliness laws of the Old Testament, which are mostly found in Leviticus, they point to a really important fact, and that's all people are unclean, and all people need to be purified. In Leviticus 11, God says, be holy as I am holy. That's the mark, that's the bar. Be holy as God is holy. Be as holy as God. Then in Leviticus 11 through to chapter 15, Moses goes through and talks about lots of things that make people unholy, that makes people unclean. And they're things that can't be avoided. Normal bodily functions. Normal things that happen within family life. Just regular, everyday stuff. They're all signs that people are unclean. Basically, everyone. And each time it goes through and says, but this is the way to become clean again. And then in Leviticus chapter 16, at the end of all of that, there's the Day of Atonement sacrifice, this time when the whole community comes together and is made clean, and a sacrifice is given. And we're told that that sacrifice is what points forward to the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus. They had it once a year. We've had it once in time. And it's done, and it's finished. You see, the story of the Bible is simple. All people need to be made clean. But there is a way for us to be made clean. They'd missed that. And instead, they got really focused on the details. And were just interested in, well, if we avoid this, then we'll be clean. And if we don't do that, then we'll manage to stay pure. They'd started using these things which were meant to be pointers to their need for purification. And instead, they'd taken them as markers for whether someone else was clean or unclean, when the truth is that nobody is. Jesus exposes this. He points at it and he says, look, even unclean food, not just the hands, but even unclean food, it doesn't touch the heart, it touches the stomach. It's never what really made someone clean or unclean in the first place. Jesus demonstrates that he has a focus on something else. He has a focus on the heart. Verse 20, and he said, "It is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person." It's our hearts and motivations and intentions that determine if we're sinful or not. That's evidenced by our actions. It's not determined by our actions. Let's go back to our garden one last time. So we really want people to enjoy this garden. We've failed twice, but we know that we know we can't put up just lots of barriers to stop them using the garden. We've tried that. We know that we can't just give them limited amount of time. We've got to let them into the garden properly. But how are we going to make them enjoy the garden? Well, what would it look like for someone to enjoy a garden? Well, I've seen people enjoy a garden, and I've enjoyed gardens before. So what does that look like? It looks like being able to go for walks. It looks like being able to be with friends or family there. It looks like being able to go for picnics. It looks like being able to run around and have fun. So these are all the things that make being in a garden fun. So we'll make sure people do those. So on arrival, gardens are more fun with people. So we'll group people together. Doesn't matter if they know the people or not. We'll group people together so that they can really enjoy the garden, because you have to be with other people to do that. Then, because we know what enjoying a garden looks like, we can work out a timetable for them. We can laminate that timetable. It can say that at this point they need to go for a picnic, and then they can kick a ball around for X number of minutes. We'll work out the optimum ways of enjoying a garden, and we'll just make people do that, because then they'll enjoy the garden, right? But you can't make people have fun just by making them do things that might look like they're having fun. It doesn't work that way. People are going to come to that garden, and if they're in the mood to run around and have fun, they're going to run around and have fun. If they're in a mood to just sit on the bough of a tree and think for a while, and that will be refreshing for them, then let them do that. If they come to that garden grumpy and with no intention of enjoying it, then you can't force them to do it. It's their hearts. It's what's going on inside of them that will determine whether they enjoy the garden or not. This isn't about gardens. But that's what the Pharisees were doing. They thought that if all the externals lined up, if all of these things that on the outside looked right, then people must be pure. If they were washing or not washing their hands, then that determined the state of their heart. It's just not the way it works. You know, there's a verse in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 22. Then in the King James Version, it's the first version that I heard this verse in. I heard it preached, and it had a lasting impact on me for quite a while. And it says this in the King James Version: "Avoid even the appearance of sin." That's a bad translation of that verse, because the original language doesn't talk about the appearance of evil or the appearance of sin. The NRSV translates it much better when it says, "Abstain from every form of evil." Because at no point does the gospel ask us to avoid the appearance of being sinful. What the gospel invites us to do is to defeat sin and to let God defeat sin in our lives. Jesus isn't interested in avoiding appearing wrong. He wants us to be released from wrong. He wants us to be released from sin so that we can live the life that God intended for us. Jesus did not do very well at avoiding the appearance of sin. He hung out with people who made him look very sinful. He hung out with sinners. He hung out with prostitutes. He hung out with people who the rest of society thought if you go near them, they're bound to bring you down. But they didn't bring him down. We as a church community and we as individuals need not to worry so much about whether the world looks at us and thinks that we're sinful. By the people that we spend time with, the people that we serve, the people that we invite to be part of our community. We as individuals need to worry not so much about whether other Christians look at our lives and think that we're holy or not. There are times when I've done something going, you know what, I know with all my heart, I believe that this is what God is calling me to do. And other people have said, you're wrong for doing that. And I'll listen and I'll engage with that, but ultimately, it's between me and God. And there are times when actually we need to do something, even though it may make us look like we're doing wrong. Because God isn't interested in what we look like. He's interested in how we are. Sometimes I think we need to spend a little bit less time looking good, a little bit more time being good. This has to start with our heart on the insides. The Pharisees wanted it to start on the outside. But you and I, we need God to make our hearts pure before our actions can follow. We can paper over all the cracks. We can pretend that we don't struggle with this. We can pretend that we aren't dragged down by that. It doesn't work. It doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't lead us into fruitfulness. It doesn't lead us into freedom. It just makes us feel more trapped. One of the other criticisms that Jesus levels against the Pharisees in Matthew 23 is he says, you're like whitewashed tombs. Tombs which on the outside have been painted white, and so they look lovely, they look clean, they look pure. But on the inside, there's still a decaying body. There's still death on the inside. It doesn't matter how good it looks on the outside. This isn't saying that the outside doesn't matter. It's not saying that our actions and our words don't matter. It's saying that they need to flow out of a heart that's been made pure before God. In Psalm 51, David, after he's been called out on his sin, on his adultery with Bathsheba, he says these words, which are often quoted out of context. He says, "For you have no delight in sacrifice. If I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise." People will say this is David saying that God was never interested in sacrifice. He was never interested in what we do. He's just interested in our heart. He wants a contrite heart. He wants a broken spirit. But a couple of verses later, when David is looking forward to a time when he has been restored, he says this, "Then you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings." He's saying, at the minute, I can do all the sacrifices I like. I can live this way. I can do all of this. I can look like all of this. It won't matter unless my heart has been brought in line. And then those things take on meaning. We can fake it. We can pretend. We can ignore parts of our life that we know need to be corrected. We know need to be lovingly brought back into line with God's purposes. We can try and do all of that. But we need to let Jesus fix our hearts. We need to let him touch us and minister to us. The gospel is not about us pretending to be good. The gospel is that Jesus died to give us holiness, to give us a good standing before God. Because all of this may sound very daunting. We're going, oh my word, well I know I've got these areas right, and maybe I am a hypocrite. Maybe I'm dragged down by this thing, and I shouldn't come to church, and I shouldn't pray, and I shouldn't do these things because as long as I've got my heart not in order, I shouldn't be able to do any of the holy stuff. That's not what I'm saying. The only true hypocrisy would be pretending that stuff just isn't in your life at all. The gospel invites us to come to Jesus because he died for us. He died so that we may have holiness. If you're a Christian, if you're a son or a daughter of God, then when God looks at you, he doesn't look at the sin that you might be thinking about this very moment. He doesn't see that. He sees his son. He sees holiness. He sees purity. The law codes and the stuff to do with cleanliness that this story originates in are all pointing us to our need for purification, but Jesus has provided that for us. We're going to sing a song later on that before the throne of God above. It's about our standing before God. When we come into his throne room, how does he look at us? And there's some words in it that say, when Satan tempts me to despair and tells me of the sin within, what do? Do I look inside? Do I look around? Do I panic? No, upward I look and see him there who made an end to all my sin. This is the end of the story. But we need to let it be part of the story instead of just papering over and pretending that things are okay. Do we have that balance right between external and internal? Do we just say, well, nothing I do matters because I'm a child of God? That's not quite right either. Or do we say, it doesn't matter what I do at all? Or do we say, it only matters what I do? God wants to start working on our hearts, and then actions can flow out of that. I wonder what external things we've learnt to use to judge other people. What things we look at other people and go, well, they're like this, so therefore their heart must be like that. That's a dangerous road to walk down. And where are we trying to avoid the appearance of evil? What parts of our life do we know we're struggling? We know there are parts of our hearts that aren't right. But instead of being honest with God or honest with ourselves or even honest with those who are close to us, with our family here, we just avoid the appearance of evil. We get by. We fake it. And are we trying to resist those temptations and those struggles in our own strength? Or by all the resources that God has given to us through Jesus' death on the cross? Which of these things do we need to work on, each of us